All right. So we are recording. Awesome. Okay, so hi everybody. I don't remember everyone's name from our group, but last time Chris and I held a Q&A session together. So welcome. I'm Patty, and for those of you who don't know Chris, say hi, Chris.
Yeah, I'm Chris. Patty and I are both facilitating sections of Malt right now, so we try to bring everybody together for these kind of Q&A happy hour. I'm sitting in a hotel room, so it's not the most festive, but
Hey,
you know,
that's good.
it works out.
It's better than driving. You said you would be driving, so we weren't sure if you'd make it or not. Yeah, so Chris works at Rhinegeist Brewery. If you don't know him, I work in the beer industry. Been around a while. If you Google my name, you'll find me really easily. Been a bunch of different places, but the focus of tonight's Q&A is going to be on Campbell. Campbell, would you introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Excited to be a part of these happy hours. I did the brewing process and refinement class last week. That was quite fun. Anyway, a little bit about me. I'm the head brewer up in Hood River, Oregon at Freem Family Brewers. I'm actually in the brewery right now. This is my office. It's glamorous, as you can see. But simultaneously, I'm actually working on a PhD at Oregon State in the barley breeding lab, really focusing on the impact of barley variety on beer flavor, but also malting and beer quality outcomes. So kind of double dipping a little bit. I like to say that in my day job, I get to go an inch deep and a mile wide, and then grad school is the exact opposite. So happy to talk about pretty much anything related to beer.
All right, so if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and ask them, or you can put them in the chat box. So there's a chat function if you go to the bottom of Zoom, and you can go on to chat. I'm going to type a message to everyone. So if you don't want to ask, you can put your questions in the chat box. And then what will happen sometimes as we get moving, Chris is really good about chiming in and giving you extra information. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and write them, and I will start out with a couple of questions. So Campbell, so you're working in probably one of the very few PhD programs that focuses on malt. Is that correct?
Yeah. So
Barley.
actually,
Yeah.
So my lab is a tried and true barley breeding lab. And back in the 80s when Pat Hayes, my advisor, started at Oregon State, I mean, really was looking at feed barley, 6-row feed barley. That was kind of a lot of where the interest was for barley breeding efforts. And over the years, as the U.S. has continued to develop their own internal supply chain of, malting barley, and 2-row malting barley has kind of become the dominant, really shifted gears. So we actually have on campus, we have the whole plant breeding side of things, but then we also have a malting lab. So we have a 500-gram micro malter and then a 100-kilo mini malter. So we can do kind of all types of batches. Our bread and butter is kind of more high throughput. So we use that 500-gram on anything that's going to be assessed for malt quality from a breeding extension side of things. And then the mini malter, our larger unit, we'll use for some of the beer flavor stuff. So we've done, we'll do anywhere between 20 and 25 batches through that a year. And much of that does go into pilot scale brewing. So there's a little 2.5 hectoliter, really nice brew house on campus at OSU, and actually the exact same system at Deschutes over in Bend. So between the two of those have really awesome access to equipment.
Yeah, you guys really upscaled since I was there. The manual brew house. You still have the manual brew house, right? You guys kept it?
I've seen it. I've never seen it.
That's what I used to brew on. Really, really exciting. So I've worked with Campbell's advisor, Pat Hayes, Dr. Pat Hayes, in the past, in my past roles, working on barley flavor. It's really, really interesting. And so I love hearing about this, about all the work that you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned feed barley. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between feed barley, and then you can go into different origins of barley and how they might have separated, like say, European barley versus North American barley over time, and what that would mean to a brewer?
Yeah, so generally, the US doesn't grow a lot of feed barley anymore. Corn and soy is much more profitable, easier to grow, higher yielding. So it's not a huge portion of what's grown in the US. One of the two largest feed barley producers are currently very topical in the news. That would be the Ukraine and Russia, grow a huge amount of feed barley in the US, or for the world supply. And so you may have heard that, malt prices may be affected by that. And that's just because of availability of barley. It's not that they're supplying a lot of your favorite craft brewers with malt. But anyway, yeah, so what separates feed barley from malt barley is usually very few quality outcomes. Usually the number one is grain protein. So when barley comes off the field, growers will take protein samples, and the maltsters will either reject it or accept it based on those protein numbers. In years past, I would say 12% was kind of that like magic number. But climate change and the extreme heat and drought of last year is really starting to put pressure on that, as it's really hard to get low protein barley when it's extremely hot and dry in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of something we're seeing a little bit. So that's kind of the big differentiation. There are varieties that are bred for feed versus malt, but often malt barley is the kind of the cash crop. You can get quite a bit more money for your malt barley. And then once we start breaking down the different types of barley, usually in the US, we're talking 2-row barley. Some of you may be familiar with 6-row barley. That was pretty common in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Usually it was looked at as really high enzyme, so really great for making adjunct lager. But as breeding efforts have improved, not only is 2-row barley now going to be higher yielding, but we'll see the enzyme package that you can see in 6-row barley. So there's not much 6-row being grown anymore. Most of it's in like North Dakota. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but I think the Miller products still use a lot of 6-row. I know they were malting it in the Golden plant for something, but I used to buy malt from Golden Malting, which is a subsidiary of Miller Coors. But it's 2-row is still now the dominant in the US, certainly. And Patty brought up, oh, sorry, go ahead, Patty.
Yeah, I was just going to interject a little bit, because when I left Miller, that's when we started phasing out 6-row. So not quite sure the timing of it, but in 2016, we started phasing out 6-row at Miller. So I don't know how much they're actually using anymore. Miller Coors, which is now Molson Coors, the legacy barley breeding program for Coors is out in Idaho. And that breeding program has really focused on getting out of 6-row. And because of the Molson Coors push, it's kind of pushed Miller off of 6-row. So just, I don't know when you were there, but there may have been a shift.
It was before that. So yeah, I left that job actually I was working in a distillery, and we bought direct from Coors, which was cool.
Yep.
Go see that cool plant.
Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
If you haven't gone on a malt house tour, I highly recommend it, because it's really different from seeing a brewery. And I'm sure all of you have been to a brewery at this point, and probably a few, but seeing a malt house is a really different experience. Getting to watch grain germinate and understand how that whole process works. Highly recommend. And now with as many craft maltsters that are out there, most of you are probably not too far from a small malt house or a big malt house.
All right, so I interjected. I want you to keep going on varietal shifts. So based on heritage or growing region. So can you get into barley varietals, and we can focus on really broad categories like European versus North American?
Yeah, so I think a cool anecdote that was told to me by a mentor in the kind of malt and beer world is that you know, the varieties being grown in continental Europe compared to the UK really helped dictate the type of brewing that was going on there. You know, this could all be a lie. So, but I'm just gonna relay it as it's fact.
I might be able to edit your lie, but
Yeah.
we'll see how far from the truth it is.
Don't call my shit. But the general idea was like, you know, your kind of British heirloom lines, like, you know, even before Maris Otter, they were really easily, when they were modifying in the malt house, there wasn't a huge separation between protein modification and cytolytic modification. So when we're breaking down beta glucans and things like that. And so it made malt that was really well done or well used for a single infusion mash tun, which is really common in UK brewing. I mean, some of the larger, you know, ale breweries in the UK making hundreds of thousands of barrels a year are still using single infusion mash lauter tuns, which is quite something to see. However, on the continent, you know, in kind of Germany, Bohemia, there was more of a separation between how they modified. And so those varieties were really well suited, you know, to get to, without overdoing your protein modification, you might end up with some high beta glucan. And so doing step mashes or decoction mashes, basically more involved mash protocols, was required to actually produce good lager beer. And so, you know, obviously those aren't the only reasons that those two types of brewing were established in those places, but it's really interesting to think about that, you know, hundreds of years ago, you know, barley type was actually dictating the kind of beers people were making.
Yeah, and I'll just interject. So one of the most famous triple decoctions is Pilsner Urquell. So one of the first really well-known lager beers, the first Pilsen from Pilsner. Pilsner, yeah.
Yeah, and is everyone familiar when I'm talking about like step mashing or decocting mashing? You know, I just don't want to like, I don't know where you are all in the class, so I don't want to like, you know, just start talking about things that you aren't familiar with.
Yeah, it's okay to say you don't know because we have a range of people. Some people are already working in breweries. Some people are, they've never brewed. This is their entrance. So do you want to just briefly describe what a decoction is?
Yeah, so step mashing in general is just anytime you're mashing at different temperatures, you know, typically, you know, start low and move up. You know, in more modern brew houses, that's done just with steam and agitation. As you're mixing, you can apply steam either usually on the outside, but sometimes you can actually get steam injected. Decoction is an old way of doing this, where you would actually pull a portion of that mash off and boil it. And depending on how much you brought over, and then mixing it back in, you could then raise the temperature of your mash up to the profile that you need. So let's say you're starting at, you know, 125 degrees, and then you want to bring it up to 140 and then 150. You would do that by actually boiling a portion of that. And so that's a real traditional way. And some, you know, craft breweries are now doing that. We do a little bit of that here on some of our kind of more, you know, rustic Bohemian lagers. Certainly anything that's got, you know, kind of a Czech inspiration will have a portion of it decocted. But even our more German style lagers, we're doing step mashes on everything.
And Campbell, what does decoction do to the flavor of the beer?
Yeah, we find it it doesn't necessarily give it like a real like cooked character, but it provides a real fullness in lighter lagers. So we always say like our Czech lager, you know, it's a light looking beer, doesn't necessarily finish particularly full, but there's a distinct like intensity to it that we don't get on our German style lagers that haven't been decocted. And so it's kind of it provides some background. You know, there is some of that like Maillard kind of compounds, like some bready, some toasty, but it mostly just gives it a more body and something that, I don't know, it's hard to describe, but certainly something that makes it more palate filling versus like our Pilsner is just like crushable. You know, you're crushing Pilsners, you're sipping Czech lagers.
Yeah. And I think that's it. The thing is like, if you put those beers side by side, that is one of the differentiators. You can almost use the same malt and you get a very distinct flavor outcome. I do believe that a lot of Pilsner Urquell, it comes from the environment and the yeast and you know, that heritage, that flavor is definitely like a house flavor. But the Czech lagers for sure have, to me, it's almost a sweetness. I call it like tiny bit of a postage stamp taste, but a lot of people don't lick stamps or envelopes anymore, so they don't know what that is. But to me, it's like this very like subtle sweetness that's from that caramelization that's happening in decoction. All right, so we'll get back.
A quick question.
Oh, go ahead. Yep.
I'm sorry if I can jump in. I'm just curious, what's that step look like in a typical mashing? Like I'm expecting that you're mashing for 60, 90 minutes, and how many times you step it up, and for how long, and what temperatures?
Yeah, great question. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the type of malt that you're bringing in, and the malt quality specs that you're looking at, as well as the type of beer you're making. You know, honestly, we use primarily North American varieties in our malt. Our Pilsner does have a little bit of German Pilsner malt in it, about 1/3. But most of our malts are really high in enzyme, so high amylytic enzyme. So a lot of potential for breaking down starch into sugar. So our mash rests are not very long. Actually, on our new brew house, we have a wet mill, and our mash rest for ales is 1 minute. So you just have so much activity going on that you really don't need to be mashing for 60 to 90 minutes for ales when you have, you know, highly modified American two-row malt or North American two-row malt. You know, for our Pilsners, you know, we've actually been playing around with that a lot because of the 2021 crop challenges. It used to be about a 40-minute mash with different steps. We just did a simple two-step. We'd go in at 144, and then we'd be there for about 20 minutes. Then we'd increase to 154 for another 20 minutes, and then we'd mash off. We've actually reduced that quite a bit because we were seeing so much attenuation because we have higher protein malt, higher enzyme package coming through. We actually had to temper back our mash, which has been challenging for other reasons. Try to balance the, you know, clarity of our downstream beer without over attenuating has been kind of our biggest challenge in Pilsner in the 21 crop year. So hopefully that noise goes away next year, but climate change isn't going away. So
Campbell, the Pilsners that you're making, they're 100% malt, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
We do have some lagers that are maybe 10% adjunct, 15% adjunct, usually, but we're also using a lot of flaked products. So these are pre-gelatinized, really readily used in either a step mash or a single infusion mash. We're doing our first with raw adjunct in the next couple weeks. And so that should be an interesting, I'll report back.
Okay. What kind of adjunct?
We're going to use corn grit.
Okay. So I had another question, but I kind of lost it in that second question I followed up with. So as we're talking about, you know, the difference between North American, European, and then how that affects how you need to make the beer to style. In North America, as Campbell said, you've got a lot more enzymatic power, and you tend to have a lot more free amino nitrogen. Do you want to talk about what free amino nitrogen is and what the challenges are with North American malt for craft beer styles?
Yeah, so free amino nitrogen is essentially a measurement of your free amino acid profile in your malt. So, you know, as we all know, you know, proteins are built up of amino acids. So your free amino nitrogen is what you get from in your malt that's actually accessible amino acids. So these can be assimilable by yeast for growth. They can also be assimilable by bacteria for contamination problems. But within that, we have a huge package of amino acids, and not all amino acids are assimilated at the same rate. So proline, for example, is the number one amino acid in malt, but it's almost not assimilated by yeast. And so what's problematic is that while you need some of these things for yeast health, you know, if you have excess, they can also be in downstream pathways to create different flavors, typically in staling reactions. So things that we look at as kind of like aged beer character. So when you have an old beer that's not necessarily been oxidized and it starts getting kind of like sherry-like, caramelly, you see this in IPAs a lot, especially big all malt IPAs. they've really just kind of gotten this like sweet, vinous character. Typically, that's some staling reactions related to amino acids. And so historically, American two-row is being bred for lager brewers who are brewing, using 40% rice or 40% corn, which provides no free amino nitrogen or, trace amounts of free amino nitrogen. So they needed malt that could make up the difference. So both between enzymes and FAN. And by doing so, they were able to have really successful fermentations with basically a 40% adjunct that's just providing starch. However, craft brewing started up and, we're all malt brewers. We typically use 100% malt or very little adjunct. And now we have a bunch of excess FAN and we don't have opportunities to get rid of it. So you try to separate it out as much as you can through, protein aggregations, but if you have excess, you're probably gonna have some downstream flavor problems. And I say this, like, these are downstream flavor problems, like in a can on a shelf 3 months later. If you're working in a tasting room brewery where direct to consumer is your bread and butter, you're probably not gonna have like a lot of Strecker aldehyde problems in your like 1 week old IPA. So as long as you can move through your beer, you'll be fine. But that was kind of a long-winded answer.
No, it was great. It was a great answer. Very happy to hear that. And I think that's the biggest challenge with North American malt for craft brewers is that sometimes you have too much enzyme, you have too much free amino nitrogen. So there's this balance, like you were saying. That enzyme, although it was really desirable for the big lager brewers because of their adjunct inclusion, is problematic for craft brewers because, like you said, you might have beer that ferments so well that your alcohol is really off, and it prevents a lot of challenges. You have to learn how to play with that malt. So, like you said earlier about, you want to have protein around 12.5%. I think the last couple of years have been really challenging, and this last year in particular. What protein levels are you seeing in your malts right now?
Bring up my COA tracker right now. So in our pale malt, it's primarily coming from Canada. It's mostly Synergy and Copeland, which are two.
From Alex.
It is from Alex. It is. So those are barley varieties. And one thing I should remind everyone is that you got to remember there's malt types and there's barley varieties. So just like you can buy pale two-row malt, but it's not the pale two-row variety. It could be a whole host of varieties that are making up that malt. So very few malts are sold based on their, the variety name. Maris Otter is kind of one of the few. But anyway, so yeah, we're seeing, so our average malt since we got all 21 crop is just over 12%, which our end of last year, end of 2020 crop, our average was 10.9. So we're up, 1.1%. And, conversely, our extracts are down. So we're seeing for every pound of malt, we're getting less sugar out of them. So we're having to use more malt to achieve the same brewing outcomes, which on top of all that, malt has gone up, fuel has gone up. So malt is more expensive than it ever has been. I mean, I've only been in the industry about, 10, 11 years, but I've never seen anything kind of quite like this. So, but yeah, it's a very interesting time to be alive, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a challenging. Last year was a very, very challenging year for barley, with the droughts in the kind of central, western Midwest into the mountain states, and then throughout Canada. So a lot of barley got rejected, came in and got rejected right away. And that's a big challenge for growers because then they have to sell it on the feed market and they don't get as much money for the feed market. Maybe they will now with the Ukraine issues, but you're going to see the prices of beef going up. If you've tried to buy a steak recently, you'll see that it's reflected kind of quickly in that Ukraine market for barley feed. But I want to go back to this issue of extract that you're talking about. Explain to us why your extract levels might be going down as your protein is going up?
Yeah, it's kind of a zero-sum game. You know, the barley kernel, you know, we're talking about these things in percentages. And as basically, it's not that your protein level is, you're not synthesizing more protein, you're just synthesizing less carbohydrate during the growth phase of the kernel. And so the riskiest time for that kernel from a brewer's perspective is during grain fill, and heat and water stress typically lead to lower carbohydrate synthesis. And so when that's happening, you know, of course the drought happened during grain fill. And so we ended up with kernels that are higher protein, but they're typically smaller. So we have, you know, thinner kernels, which are harder to malt. They're also harder to mill. So there's huge amounts of just like physical properties that throw brewers off. And then, you know, on top of that, then there's less sugar actually in there. So you have to use more malt just to see the same yields off your brew house. And so, you know, Chris is working at a brewery. You guys are probably 100 some odd thousand barrels now. Yeah, I mean, when you're average at like 50 pounds of, you know, malt per barrel or something like that, if all of a sudden that becomes 55 pounds of malt per barrel, you know, that's a huge amount. That's 500,000 pounds of malt that they're adding that they weren't going to add. So unfortunately, the price of beer doesn't seem to go up as fast as the price of anything else, which is easy for me to say because I drink for free. But
yeah, I would expect to see a steeper increase, and I haven't really seen that, although I drink a lot of beer for free too, so I don't. And I tend to drink a lot of Coors Light these days, so it's probably less of an impact. But so one thing I want to go back to is your process. So like, say your C of A comes in and you see that increase in protein and that decrease in extract, like even if it's a 3% decrease in extract and a 1% increase in protein, what are some of the things you might have to do in the brew house to accommodate those shifts?
yeah, so I mean, the easiest one obviously is what I mentioned, is chuck more malt at it. And sometimes that's what you have to do. We've tried to, you know, the protein one is tough because usually if I see high protein, I might like adjust a protein rest or something along those lines to, you know, break down some more of that protein so we can separate it out in the kettle and the whirlpool. However, what we're finding is that our enzymes are so high this year that if we extend our rests at all, we're seeing just huge amounts of attenuation shifts because the enzymes have more time to work. You know, I'm sure you're all familiar with kind of the optimal temperature ranges for different enzymes, you know, beta amylase, alpha amylase primarily, but they still work at different temperatures. They're not like totally not active at, you know, 140 or something. So even if you're doing a protein rest at 144, you're still getting a lot of saccharification going on. So alpha's breaking down long chains, beta's starting to chomp and, you know, produce a lot of maltose. And so we'll see, you know, we were seeing about like a 0.3, you know, degree Plato change in final gravity. And on Pilsner, that's like bringing it to like 1.5. And that's like becoming such a dry beer. It's obviously shifting ABVs. And so throwing off the flavor profile quite a bit. And the reason, but then we're now fighting haze. So, you know, it's kind of damned if you don't, damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of thing. So you're kind of always finding this balance because there's not just one lever to pull and say like, we fixed it. You know, anything you do, malt, regardless of malt, anything you do in the brewing industry, if you make one change, you're going to have to make another change to accommodate for that. So it's been a fun project to kind of keep managing, but we're getting by.
So I have a couple more questions. A lot of this course is kind of focused around understanding your C of A when it comes in and things that you might have to change for that, right? Like, and we can go down so many rabbit holes, but we'll keep it pretty basic. So what would be one parameter that you would look for in your, like you might see on your C of A that would affect how you mill your malts?
Ooh, great one. So the easy answer is friability, because friability is essentially, I just say it's like, how crushable is this malt? But I actually don't love it as a milling parameter. The two things I would look at are homogeneity, if you get that. So that's an assortment. So you might see, less than 5/64ths, greater than 7/64ths. That's basically how many kernels were retained on different sieves. So that's a good one. If you see a huge spread in your homogeneity, that means milling is going to be challenging because you're trying to mill really big kernels and really small kernels. If you have a 2-roller mill, you have one setting. So you're either setting it for the big ones or the small ones. Set it for the big ones, then you're passing whole kernels through. Set it for the small ones, you're pulverizing those larger ones and may have really challenging louders. So that's one I always look at. But then also beta glucan. And so beta glucans are non-starch polysaccharides. So these are long chains of sugar molecules, but they're not digestible by yeast. And they kind of make up a lot of that starch matrix in the endosperm. And when I see really high beta glucan numbers, I know we're gonna have a lot of issues with milling. Those kernels are probably gonna be pretty hard. They're gonna be really challenging to get really good extract and really good separation on. And unless you have probably even a 6-roller mill, you're really gonna struggle with high beta glucan grain coming through your mill. 2 rolls are gonna be really challenging. 4 rolls kind of, in between somewhere. We have both a small 2-roller mill for our old brew house, and then we have a large wet mill for our larger brew house. So that's kind of changed everything on my perception. So there's a million things to do to just grind your malt and to throw it in the mash tun.
Yeah, and I think that, it'd be great if you lived in a world where you could just pulverize your malt because you have a mash press, but not everyone has a mash press. So let's take it back to the lauter then. So let's take it back even to, say your malt comes in really high in beta glucans. So you need to maybe adjust your mill settings. What else would you target for changes in your mash and maybe your lauter?
Yeah, I mean, beta glucan, you can kind of do some beta glucanase rests. I've never really had great success with that. Usually what I see if we have really high beta glucan is that separation is going to be challenging. So you should go in kind of nursing your lauter ahead of time. Depending on the technology, of course, just may want to thin your mash out a little bit, give yourself a better set, maybe even like use some rice hulls or something along those lines. But that's going to be that's going to really create viscosity problems. I mean, we're talking like pretty high. So I've never really had challenges even up to 200 ppm, even on like single infusion vessels. But I've seen some, not to throw craft malt under the bus, but I've seen some craft maltsters who because they're trying to use challenging varieties, they're using things like, people want heirlooms. Well, there's a reason these things are heirlooms and not commonly used varieties these days. But you're going to have to, if you want that, you're going to also have to put up with 400 beta glucan. And really, I think what you can do is either add enzyme or just have to be willing to nurse a lauter.
What about what would be something on your C of A that might increase the number of cuts that you need to make in your lauter?
Well, certainly beta glucan is a good one.
Okay.
Soluble protein is also going to make that challenging. And again, it kind of comes back to that one we were talking about, those physical properties, because it's going to affect how you're milling. And so to me, your cuts are going to be really dictated by the constituency of your malt, of your grist now is going into your mash tun and then lauter tun. And so understanding, you could read like Kunza or whatever book you want, and you'll get someone will give you sieve analysis and says like, you have to hit these. And I brewed long enough to know, no, you don't. You hit whatever, you need to establish whatever, sieve analysis works for you, what gets you the best efficiency and the best, outcome. And then you set those, and then you just try to achieve those kind of things. So we did a big project at my previous brewery, and we were way off from like where, your like textbook says but we were getting, 92% mash efficiency on a single infusion mash lauter ton. So it's really understanding your equipment, understanding how the grain's going to process through your mill, and then how it's being handled into your mash tun, and then how do you actually hydrate, how do you mix, and then do you have rakes and how do you use them effectively?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because if you look at the C of A, right, the C of A is produced by using a Congress mash, Congress wort. Can you explain to everyone how that might be different than an infusion mash?
Oh, you should have gotten Glenn Fox up here.
Oh, next time.
Shall be doing the IOB 65. So I mean, that's like another old school. So your COA is almost guaranteed to be produced with a Congress mash. So basically what they're doing is it's a laboratory replication of a step mash. And so, the Congress mash was developed by the European Brewing Congress, and who are the people who are very interested in there, or there are lager brewers who are doing step mashes. And so they want a representative, laboratory mash for their brewing process. At the same time, the Institute of Brewing in the UK developed the 65C method, which is a single infusion laboratory mash. And you get widely is not the right word. Widely in the laboratory sense is, different numbers from that. And so you have to also understand what you're getting on your COA is not necessarily the work you're going to produce. And so again, I almost like a lot of times I think of COA as like unitless numbers. They're not telling you what you're going to get. You just need to know how they affect your process. And so, if 12% protein is, you've seen problems before, well, then you should be aware of those. Like these things don't ever tell you how to do things. You need to know what your baseline is based on the information you have and your experience, and then you can establish SOPs around that.
Yeah, it's such a good answer, and I think super informative for people, especially people who have never brewed. You might be a little bit lost now, and when you go to the project, you're like, oh, I have all these parameters and I have to guess what I'm supposed to do. Like, yeah, there are guides, like, so you can try these things. But as Campbell is saying, is sometimes you try those things that the textbook recommends and they don't work. So as a craft, the textbooks are mostly written by non-craft brewers, right? And their legacy analyses, the MEBAC, all the ASBC methods, they're built off of big adjunct beer, right? And even the all malt beer in Europe that's been brewed historically is very different than what a lot of craft brewers in North America and now in Europe as well, or in China, all over the world are trying to achieve. So you really do have to pay attention to that C of A and how it comes in, and understand, okay, so when I get this from my malt stir, this is what I might have to do in my brewery, because not only will it vary by style of beer, it's going to vary by your infrastructure. So your vessel size, your vessel shape, your tools that you have, the number of breaks that you have, your, all those things. And
if you have,
yeah, if you have those. And let's talk a little bit, because this course doesn't really talk too much about it, but let's talk a little bit about the potential benefits and drawbacks of having a mash press and what that would mean for you.
Yeah, I mean, so the mash filter was originally developed to, maximize extract. Basically, it's designed like a beer filter, but you put so let me step that back. So the principles of lautering are, one of the variables is surface area. I'm not going to draw out Darcy's law for everyone, but the idea, I don't think it's off the top of my head. But one of the variables is surface area. And what a mash filter does is it basically creates a huge amount of surface area across your grain bed in a smaller footprint. So, think about, like, if you had a lauter ton and it's infinitely large and you can have an infinitely small mash bed, you can extract as much sugar as possible for it. Because if, as it gets infinitely smaller, there's nothing preventing that sugar from being extracted. What a mash filter does is condenses that as much as possible. As well as it also it adds external pressure on top of gravity. So by not only putting smaller amounts of, or smaller grain bed depth in each plate, you can extract more sugar that way, but then you can actually push pressure on those to extract as much sugar as possible. And so, I mean, when they came out, they were, achieving like 105% of laboratory extract, because again, the laboratory extraction was based on, designed around a lauter ton. And it's basically just using a filter bed. So
Filter paper. Not even a bag, just a piece of paper. Yeah.
So a mash filter is really effective at that. They make them smaller now, down to like 20 barrel size. So, I know there's been some craft adopters there. I mean, they're still very expensive pieces of equipment. So you don't see them, if you ever go to the, Coors plant in Golden, there's a ton of them. There's one across the street at Full Sail.
Yep,
So they were an early adopter. And so there's some around there. However, lauter ton technology is also, improved, and between, wet milling and a big lauter ton, we wouldn't see a huge gain on a mash filter. We'd see some, but not a huge one. And again, you're not going to see them in your average craft brewery just based on, pure cost. And they're not going to make great ales, in my opinion.
What is the Hood River? Do you know what their barrelage is?
Full Sail?
Oh yeah, Full Sail. Sorry, in Hood River. Yeah, Full Sail.
Beer or seltzer?
Well, what's their total production volume, and then you can break it down for us if you want to.
I think they're doing it's been changing a lot. They do a lot of contract seltzer there, and I'm not throwing them under the bus for that by any means. They're making a lot of that.
They make money.
It's mostly seltzer nowadays, by like 10 to 1.
Yeah.
So at their peak of beer, they were making 125,000 barrels of beer. And so, there's some really good white papers out there actually that focus on Full Sail from like a cost savings perspective on, how much less malt they could use because they could recover all of their extract, and really see high efficiencies there. But unfortunately now it's not getting used as much as it used to.
Yeah. And so it's funny because you caught me and I was like, wait, no. So Miller, and I don't think they do anymore. Miller used to do a lot of contract brewing at Full Sail. So when we would go to our audits and all of our tours for like hop selection, we always went to Full Sail because they were one of our brewers. So we called it the Hood River Brewery. It wasn't a Miller brewery, but it was a contract brewery for Miller. And
oh, that's cool.
I also believe that they did quite a bit of contracting for Woodmere.
Yeah, I don't think they do anymore.
Yeah.
They've really shifted to seltzer production. So.
Well, making seltzer is like printing money. So maybe that mash press isn't getting used very much anymore.
Yeah.
I've
always wanted to see advanced like dextrose handling, like conveyance. I thought that would be really interesting.
Interesting. Yeah. And I like that I almost forgot that Coors, the legacy brewery in Golden, they have mash press. They were one of the first for mash press technology, and they use enzymes as well. So they get extra high efficiency through the mash presses. So, all right. So we've got like 12 minutes left in the hour. I want to make sure anybody who has questions. I love that Chris, you chimed in. I was waiting for you to post something on mash filters. Is there any questions from the audience or Chris? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that I was gonna say that podcast is a bit of a commercial, which they sometimes are, but worth a listen. I think some of the things that some of the selling points in that are interesting to me because it's even things around like batch size variability that you can do with a mash filter that is a lot harder to do with a traditional lauter ton. You're just taking plates out and you can do really small batches. Now you have to have the fermentation space to, appropriate, you can't put 10 barrels into a 200 barrel fermenter and expect it to be happy. But if you have the tank variety, that was something that was like, I'd never even thought of a mash filter for that benefit of being able to do super variable batch sizing. Whereas, I was laughing, Cam, when you were talking about that. We have a German brew house, and it is super happy making like 11 Plato beer. Our flagship is 16 Plato. So it works, but it is definitely, these are questions that you should be asking when you're looking at equipment or designing equipment of, Whirlpool is basically an afterthought for Germans. It's something that we use all day, every day. So, regardless of what you're thinking about what your goal is when you're putting these things together and when you're developing your recipes, and I talk to a lot of people who are, early stage, brewery startup and things like that. It's like, yeah, know what you want to do and start with that with your equipment. Everything's going to change, but I don't know. I was just Googling. There's apparently a seltzery here in Louisville. So I don't know if they make seltzer there or if it's just a bar. I'll have to report back. But yeah, I mean, there's figuring out how to solve those problems, I think is the fun. Yeah, it's a new word apparently. But yeah, figuring out how to solve those problems, I think is really, it's the challenge, and that's what can be really fun. But yeah, I mean, adapting. I think, Patty, you were talking about like, well, what do you do when, do you adjust your mill when you have a different lot? We have 2 different base malts, so depending on the beer, we're not going to be adjusting our mill a whole bunch because we're going back and forth between brewing different brands. And even that is something that we struggle with when, if our pale, I really hate, we have a pale base malt and a 2-row base malt, which is all 2-row, but I hate it so much. But it's if one of those, if one of our shipments of like our 2-row, for example, comes in and it's a little bit, smaller on that kernel size, we have to make that decision of like, okay, are we going to try to cram a bunch of brewing with 2-row into the first part of the week and adjust the mill, or just kind of hope for the best? And things like that are it's not only just on a single batch or a single type of beer or a single day. When you get into more full scale production, we're doing eight batches in 24 hours. So, even Campbell saying like, yeah, we're using more malt in our beers to make up for that extract. But even things like a batch taking 20 minutes longer is really cumulative. And it's, at scale, those efficiencies matter a lot more than when I was at a brewery that was, much, much smaller. A double batch was a big day for us. And so you're a lot more flexible to kind of wing it.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely relate to that. We talk about louders in the terms of like minutes. It's like if your louder takes over 2 hours and you're going into like 2:05, like you're through. The late person's getting out late. Like you already know. It's like we have a hard target of for ales like an hour 50 minutes, and an hour 51 minutes. 6 times a day. It's like, well, yeah, it's an extra 6 minutes, but then you lost some time somewhere else, and if you can save that time. So yeah, having those throughput challenges on larger brew houses is always really interesting when you're talking malt.
Any questions from the group for Campbell? He's such an expert. We have him here. Take advantage.
Sounds like a lot of adjustments are through your process and knowing what your equipment is, but is there anything on a COA that you would just outright reject using that malt?
Man, if my maltsters gave me the COA before it went into the silo, maybe. But unfortunately, that's not how we don't have the scale to actually run it that way. Larger breweries certainly do. I worked at a large whiskey distillery, and we would actually we would have blown through the silo before our COA even showed up. So sometimes you just have to, you use it for understanding your process. Sometimes you just have to make those decisions. We do a sensory check, just very quick. We like look at the sample, and the driver always pulls the sample, and I always say, if they can't get us the best sample and like something's wrong in that one, like, they're just taking it. You hope that they're like getting the best part of it. And if there's something wrong with the best part of it, we might have an issue there. But thankfully nothing yet has ever come up.
Yeah, it used to be when I first got to Miller, we still had a pretty good malt lab, and they would do analysis and they'd reject rail cars. They'd send them back. But now they just had all the, as far as I know, Miller, Molson, Coors, they don't do any malt analysis. And so what they require is they have specifications in their contract. So we are required, when I was at RAR, we were required to meet those specifications before the rail car went out. And if we absolutely couldn't, we're on the phone. Like my VP was on the phone. This is what we got. Do you want us to send it or not send it? Because there's no other malt, basically. Like 2021 crop, a lot of people, it's really hard to make the target specifications for the big contracts. So, but as Campbell said, to small brewers, you don't have that option. You probably used it before it's rejected. But any other questions? What about, since we have 4 more minutes, Campbell, what about if someone wants to grow some barley? What would you recommend? What would you suggest to them?
Know your growing environment. We've talked a lot about the challenges of last year from the drought and heat in the West. Most malting barley is grown in the Mountain West in the US and in Canada. However, it was like a double punch in the gut, because there's not as much malting barley grown in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast and Midwest anymore, partially because of corn. As corn moved in, it brought Fusarium, which is a fungus that infects malting barley, or barley in particular, and creates lots of host of problems. I won't go to that. But there was a lot of late season summer rain. And so barley was undergoing pre-harvest sprout. That's where it's actually so moist in the field where the barley will actually start undergoing germination while still on the plant. And so you got Eastern barley that's, getting rejected because of that. Then you get crappy barley out West. So it was a real challenge last year. So I guess maybe the answer is don't do it. But no, the plug I should make is that if you're going to grow barley, you should grow winter barley. Winter barley is becoming more and more of interest as you plant it in the fall. It overwinters and then sprouts in the spring. Harvested a little earlier, about a month, 6 weeks earlier than spring barley. But when its water requirements are typically when water is abundant. So you might get some winter snow melt, spring rains, and it does typically yield a little higher than spring barley's, a little less disease pressure. So, unless you live in Manitoba, I definitely would say, look at winter barley. We're going to people are planting a lot more of it. I'm actually going down to Northern California in a few weeks to go look at winter barley in Tule Lake up at the Klamath Basin, because spring barley is probably not even going to be a practical thing anymore with drought in that region. So they're looking winters pretty hard. So Pat Hayes would be proud of me for saying that.
I would think so. What do you think the latitude cutoff for that is, Campbell? Because I think in Minnesota, that's not going to work for us here.
Higher every year.
Yeah.
But actually, no, in Minnesota, at UMN, is that what you say?
Yeah, University of Minnesota. Yeah.
They're doing a lot of, they're actually on the forefront of understanding low temperature tolerance. And so understanding how to breed in more cold tolerant genes into winter barley so that they can survive, see less winter kill even in Minnesota. And so there's quite a bit of, it's not commercialized yet in Minnesota. It's still very spring heavy, but even in the Mountain West, Southern Idaho, they're growing a lot of winter barley now. And so we're going to see it, more and more as these kind of like, milder winters. And so even push it up. And they do require some snow. So it does need to snow for winter barley to succeed, because it actually getting a little snow on the field insulates the barley itself. So what you don't want is dry, super cold. So like inner basin Colorado can be tough if it doesn't get enough moisture, but it's just like -10 in the San Luis Valley.
Awesome. Well, I have a hard stop because I have a yeast section I need to hop on to, but thank you so much, Campbell. Awesome. You're so informative. You know so much, and we really appreciate you being here for us.
Well, yeah, I mean, share my contact info if anyone's curious, happy to talk about malt or the brewing industry or whatever. Mountain biking. Those are things I do.
Ooh, I did that this weekend. We did 20 miles today. It was good.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This is recorded, so I will save it and figure out how to post it to you. And have a great Sunday night, everyone.
See everybody.